Welcome to Hillsdale College's Washington, D.C. campus. I'm Matthew Spalding, the Vice President for the college back here in Washington, D.C., and also the Dean of our new Van Andel Graduate School of Government. And I'm here this evening. We're here this evening with a great friend of mine and a wonderful scholar, Amity Shlaes. Amity was previously at the Wall Street Journal's editorial board and published a weekly column, and wrote a great book in 1999 called The Greedy Hand, where I first met her. We had her do something for that book. She's written a very important book on the New Deal, The Forgotten Man, a new history of the Great Depression, of which there's a graphic version, which I've not seen, I have to say. And then a book which is a personal favorite, although those are great works, which came to my attention, wonderfully titled Just Coolidge, which she wrote in 2013. And she's on the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation board, which I'm a big fan of. So we have a number of things in common. But tonight we're going to talk about her new book, which is The Great Society, A New History, which is just out, and we have copies of here for all of you to buy. And I've been reading it and enjoying it immensely, especially given the connection between that book and your previous book on the New Deal. And I'm struck, as I've always been struck, about how so many of the questions we deal with today, healthcare, education, poverty, standards of living, these are issues that come out of the Great Society. But you seem to be saying it's not that great. And indeed, it might have had some problems.
Might have.
And so I want to start with some general questions about the book, but also about that period, because it turns out there's a lot of things we can learn from studying that period that might be extremely applicable today. So start off by how should we, if we're looking back in history, how should we look at what is the Great Society and how should we perceive that as a thing? What do we make of that?
Great Society. I think you might have seen this morning that one of the presidential candidates, Mike Bloomberg, said it was time for a war on poverty. So that's a phrase from the Great Society. I think you always start with what. I would just stop and say I'm very glad to be here. I'm very impressed with Hillsdale and a new graduate school and Dr. Spalding and the Van Andel Lecture Hall and school. What an achievement this is. A presence that was not here before is here and very central. No one, and very admirable. So what do we learn in school? Though maybe not at Hillsdale, but what do we generally learn in school about the Great Society in the 60s? Well, the 60s are taught non-logically. That's the first thing to say. So when you hear about the 60s, it's usually sort of tries to replicate the kaleidoscope, maybe the drug-related experience. So there'll be loud music, Woodstock, napalm, tragedy, hippies, Nixon, looking bereaved and resentful. And so it's almost hard to get a logical picture. Certainly it's hard to get a chronology of the period from the way it's taught. And that's a separate problem to the problems of earlier periods where, for whatever sins are contained in earlier tellings of earlier periods, they are usually chronological. And man is chronological. We need that. Thematic is very difficult for us to retain or analyze. It's sort of pre-analyzed. So that's the problem with the history of the Great Society. The biggest problem is not left, right, excuse me, or where you are in the Vietnam War, or when you switched. It's that it's taught more with emotion and kaleidoscope than with logic, to me. So I said, well, what is this period? In the 1930s, we had the New Deal, and what is Great Society? It sounds as ambitious as New Deal, and it was in fact more ambitious because the New Deal took place in a time of genuine economic emergency. If 1 in 4 is unemployed, that's a real problem, and people have to come up with an answer. And Franklin Roosevelt, before him Herbert Hoover, did, and we may not like the answer and have had another that we would have liked to have applied in 1932 or 33, but there's the unavoidable fact of the national emergency. This is a different story because we were actually doing pretty well in the early 60s. Everything seemed to be getting better in every way. The 50s were a pretty good decade. Everything seemed to be getting better in every way. And we'll come back to this, Matthew, but you know that poverty went down dramatically, if you want to make war on poverty, in the 1950s, basically because of economic growth. So there were, what do you give, what's the thing you give a poor person more than anything else that he wants? A job, right? And so the 50s turned out to be a great decade with jobs, even sometimes with benefits. And we thought, oh, well, given how strong we are and that we're a superpower and all, let's just clean up the rest of our little problems, cure poverty, as Franklin Roosevelt said. And I remember the writer Norman Podhoretz said, we all thought poverty could be cured. This was just after World War II, for those who had fought in World War II, a kind of mopping up action, domestic. Because if you can win Europe or defeat Japan, of course you can help poor people and all will be better. That was the very ambitious attitude in the early 60s.
Yeah, there's a great chart in the back of the book showing the decline, it's very, very small for you to, but showing the decline of the rate of poverty, but then it kind of flattens out after that.
That's right, yeah. So, and I want to mention here John Cogan of Hoover, who wrote a fantastic book called The High Cost.
Good Intentions?
Good Intentions, I think. Yeah. Anyway, it's all data and it's all true. So he also gets at this point. We did not cure poverty, even though Franklin Roosevelt hoped we might and Lyndon Johnsons swore we would. We may have brought it down a bit. At first, when the Great Society started and you look at the chart, you see poverty going down sort of as fast, and you can look at the points underlying the PowerPoint and decide, as it did in the 1950s, and then poverty, by the official definition established by our government, leveled off at 10%, a little more, and it's still there. So curing poverty didn't happen. That was the promise of the Great Society, and it didn't happen. That's the main thing. And I'm really happy to have the framers here instead of a PowerPoint for you.
So you've already alluded to the comparison between the Great Society and the New Deal. Let's broaden that a bit. And look at the various, what we want to call waves of liberalism in the 20th century. Because the other one we have to add to that is the early progressive movement. It strikes me that it might be that the Great Society has actually more similarities to the early progressives. There was a sense, that somehow they could fix things and through expertise and more government and bureaucracy. What do you put the Great Society in this larger motif of what modern liberalism did over the 20th century?
Well, we used to think that progressive social workers worked where? In the states. The lady from the state of Missouri or from the county came to your house and said whatever she had to say. They might be funded by the federal government in part, but it came from the states. So early progressivism, the kind that inspired Theodore Roosevelt, was in the state of Massachusetts, in the state of New York, and that's where the progressives came from. We never imagined we would be running the social work business from Washington, even in times of prosperity. Most of us didn't, anyhow. So what happened in the early 1960s is we said, forget the states. The federal government needs to do this. Only the federal government can do it. And the book opens actually with Michael Harrington, who was a socialist, didn't work for Moscow, was just, what was wrong with these socialists was not that they were traitors, it was that they were wrong about their philosophy, right? Didn't work, a nice man, kind of an early J.D. Vance. He focused on hillbillies. They had a problem. Some of that was social. Let's figure that out. Alcohol, trouble, and wrote a book called The Other America. And that, he said, the problem of America, these deep-seated problems of families and no food sometimes, or the wrong food, or wrong attitudes, only the federal government is capable of solving this. Only Washington. And there was some consensus for that, even beginning under Kennedy, although Kennedy didn't get the legislation. And it only strengthened. Only Washington can do this. And remember, I'll just say one last thing. A lot of the men who were leading our country, and they were mostly men, were what? Veterans. So most of the time, this is before Vietnam, they had seen the federal government do something good, win a war, and they might have had a benefit or one or the other. When they came home, they might have had GI Bill, they might have had subsidy for housing that made entry, and certainly education, and there are people in this room probably who, it was the attitude of General Patrick Moynihan. I never had to pay for school because the government took care of me. I trust the government. So they did trust the government, the federal government, at a very high level of trust.
So does the Great Society grow out of the New Deal? Does it grow out of these earlier roots? Is it something different? Is there a shift in liberalism?
It's just more.
What is your read?
It's just more ambitious.
But
so it grows. It's. I mean, if you look for logic in it, you can find strands of logic, depending on the person, right? But what it was a general consensus that we had to do something. And imagine we're having a theater in the background, the bombs are going off all the time. Off stage, that's Vietnam, right? Off stage, the battle rumbles, and the tension of sending 400, 500,000 people very suddenly over to Asia is there. So this idea, Vietnam is a strand, the progressive impulse is a strand, and another strand is Lyndon Johnson's personal ambition. Lots of biographers, Cairo most recently, have covered that, but here's a person who's the child of the New Deal. He was a Roosevelt pleaser, a very effective congressman, and it was said, there's a cartoon, if you want something done quick in the New Deal, you get Lyndon Johnson, the young man who worked with youth in the state of Texas and actually had to tell the farmers they should plow over their crops, and that was economic logic. You plow over your crop and then you get money from the federal government. And the farmers, he had to convince the farmers, and the farmers were kind of dubious about that, and their mules were even more dubious because the mules in Texas are trained not to step on the little fledgling plants, right? The whole experience of a mule is not to step on plants, and here they were destroying something. So Lyndon Johnson did yeoman service to Franklin Roosevelt on executing a sometimes nonsensical New Deal. And he said, when I grow up, I'm going to finish Franklin Roosevelt's agenda. Right. And I'm going to finish Harry Truman's agenda. Harry Truman wanted something like Medicare. He hadn't got it through. Johnson was deeply proud, a proud man that he could get that through. But you want to think he's ambitious, so he plays to his strengths, master of the Senate. And I don't even focus too much on Johnson in the book, so we'll stop there because he's just part of the story. But that's him,
right,
ambition right. and glory.
Perhaps even being greater than the New Deal.
Yeah,
I mean, because one of your charts shows it how the Great Society programs actually are larger than the New Deal programs at a certain point.
Oh, of course, yeah. And if you have a chart, which we have in the back, you will see that our commitments to the Great Society cost more than our commitments to New Deal programs today. That is, the papers our lawmakers signed in the 60s committed us to spending more today than even the New Deal. What's interesting is Walter Lippmann, the commentator, wrote a critique of the New Deal, and it was called a good society. And one reason Walter Lippmann called it good was he was signaling we should draw back from these Superman ambition projects. Great, right. Great is wrong, good, but Johnson liked great. He was very proud of the phrase. He introduced it at the University of Michigan in 1964, and if not great, then not at all was his attitude.
Right. I think the phrase Great Society was actually used by John Dewey at one point. It's actually an old progressive phrase.
Yes, it was even used by the Fabian socialists in England.
So it does actually have a history to it.
And we will have great in England also means big, right? It doesn't just mean high. Right. So by Great Society, actually, in England, they meant a society that is networked from town to town across a country. because before the railroad and the telegraph, towns were pretty isolated. And now we had a great society, and the newspapers began to come on the train in the morning, and we could hear what was going on in London in practically real time. That was what the Fabian socialists imagined, but they also imagined right away that if a society is great, broad, high, it must have great planners. Right. You can see that in the language too. And planning is a huge part of great society, ours in the 60s.
Right, yeah. That's what I meant by the sense of going back to the early progressives, planning and expertise. So the main elements of the Great Society, correct me if I'm wrong, right? In LBJ's his famous speech, healthcare, health, education, the environment, are those really the main areas?
Yeah, he had cities. He classed them cities, country, classroom, and all those things are.
Why those, and what was their thinking on them?
Well, we did need some environmental law or environmental habit. That was clear. This was the era when you couldn't drive through Gary because it smelled too bad. We did, but it had to roll up the window, right? LBJ was very concerned about. He was very much of a car person. You don't see him walking a lot. And I think America would be different if presidents could walk down the street because he was a vehicular president. He had an amphibious car, right? So he liked to beautify highways. Lady Bird did, along with the beginning of the environment. Of course, Nixon did more, and I include Nixon in the Great Society. That one of the revisions of this book is that Nixon is really just a follow-on to Johnson. The classroom, Johnson was a school teacher, so that appealed to him, and he believed rightly, I would say, and you would too probably, that education is much of the answer to the ills of poorer families. If they know more, they can earn more money.
Okay, so one could say that's a reasonable argument for those three areas of involvement. How did it become the Great Society? Was this good intentions gone bad? Was this the fatal conceit of planning? Was this just great ambition to get the federal government involved? Was it to build a
it was a power drive. We want to stay in power, so we want to do more and more impressive things so people will reelect us. That's the way the book ends, with Nixon seeking reelection. But I'm not sure what you're asking. What I do say in the book, what I show in the book, is first they tried the war on poverty, and they had weird results with that. The poverty law, the Economic Opportunity Act, which created the poverty office of Sergeant Shriver, seemed a fairly harmless law, but actually did quite a bit of harm. What am I thinking of? Many in this room are concerned about federalism, right? What is a state in charge of, and what is a town in charge of? We had poverty in American cities. The mayors all had poverty people. Maybe they called them assistants, not poverty, but they had poverty people. Many of the mayors were Democrats. They helped Lyndon Johnson get elected in 1964. I'm thinking here of Richard J. Daley. And so when Johnson declared war on poverty, Richard J. Daley put all his poverty ideas in a box, big box, mailed it to Washington. Here's what I need money for that you owe me because of what I gave you. And that is not what came out of the Poverty Czar office because of the infatuation with reform and sometimes social democratic, or we would sometimes call them socialist ideas. What came out of that office was Sergeant Shriver, a nice man, brother-in-law of the late president, kind of noble, hard to dislike, veteran, created the Peace Corps, running this, sent his own poverty people to the towns. And I'm thinking some of the people in the room may have known of that, been part, his own poverty people. And those poverty people believed in community activism, by which they meant, let's go to the town hall and protest and try to get whatever we need here. We thought it would be jobs, but it ended up being housing, landlords, and so on. And the mayors could not believe it. They had elected Lyndon Johnson, and now Johnson's very own people were bothering them in their mayor office, disturbing their day, and not helping them with their problem of poverty. And in the book, I tell the story of Sam Yorty, the mayor of Los Angeles, who said, there will be riots in Los Angeles unless you help me, President Johnson, basically, with my poverty programs. And he got into a jurisdictional squabble with the poverty office, the mayor of Los Angeles versus Sergeant Shriver, all spring, and the money that was promised didn't come. What's worse than no money? Money that was promised and doesn't come. What's worse than money that's never promised? Money that was promised. And that failure of Yorty, and it was his failure too, to bring the money he said would be there to create hundreds and hundreds of jobs for the youth of Watts, contributed to the rage in Watts, along with all the other factors that are more famous, such as the rough police department and so on. So sometimes when you have multiple jurisdictions, all you have is jurisdictional lacunae and chaos, right? And that often happened. The other mayors also complained daily, said, does the president know he's sending money to, I can't remember what he put, but subversives, some word like subversives. Does he know that? He daily couldn't believe it, that Johnson would be so naive. And I think Johnson himself was kind of not really aware of what Shriver was doing. And Shriver just wanted to get things done fast, and Johnson was pressuring him. So this was a great Shriver is one of the fools of my book, because he was a nice man who did a naive thing and paid for it terribly. Right.
So let's try to draw out some broader lessons here, and then we'll open up for questions.
Oh, sure.
Because there's a lot in your book which I found fascinating about how there was a push for an idea. Perhaps because of idealism, perhaps because of politics, but then there's often a compromise or a pushback by people like Wilbur Mills or Daniel Patrick Moynihan, but they kind of got taken on that because it took on a life of its own. Is a lesson here, beware of idealism and government coming together? Is it unintended consequences? Is it don't compromise with idealists and zealots? I mean, what's the larger?
Well, beware of marginal increases, and we know that from government. A little. What's that?
Some of these were, because you pointed out that Medicare was an add-on. It was a small add-on program that was agreed to, but then it became.
Yeah, and Wilbur Mills.
What do we learn from this for today? Because this is what we're debating.
Wilbur Mills was
the kind of debates we're having today about what we should do.
He was chairman. He was known as the powerful Wilbur Mills. I think until I was 10, I thought his name was powerful, because the influential of the Ways and Means Committee. And Wilbur Mills was a government expander, but also a pragmatist. And he went along with Medicare and kind of liked it because of a lot of other trades he had going in his complex business. And then Medicare cost a lot more than he thought it would, and he was embarrassed. He had told his constituents at home it wouldn't cost this much, and and he became wise. Everett Dirksen is the same way. Everett Dirksen supported Johnson on civil rights, which is very important to the end of the filibuster, of laws that are very important, that are also in this period. But when it came to some labor laws, Everett Dirksen said, count me out. This is too much support of organized labor. So I think if you would pick a philosopher, it would be Hayek. And why Hayek, if you haven't heard of him or don't know about him, Hayek spoke of a thing called the knowledge problem. And basically what it says is government is insulated from knowledge by the political process. You only get feedback at an election every 4 years, maybe every 2 years, every 6 years, right? And you only talk to your friends in government. Whereas a small business is in the market every day. And by night, it knows whether it did well with its product that day and perhaps even how to adjust it. So the government was so insulated from reality most of the time, it couldn't really figure out what it was doing or what was wrong about that. And Hayek, of course, also has Road to Serfdom, and and what Road to Serfdom says is we're not living in Zeno's paradox. You actually do get to serfdom, even if you take little steps, right? It's not like, oh, we'll never get there. You actually get to serfdom because entrenched interest groups, in this case, the silent majority, the forgotten men, once they have a benefit, as Thomas Sowell says, they don't want to let it go. And when there are enough entrenched groups, it's very hard to reform. And I feel even silly saying this in Washington, where you know this better than I.
Let's open up for some questions. I know that there's some microphones, I believe. Fellow right there in the back.
Thank you very much for coming to speak. One of the things, maybe a little less now, but certainly 10 or more years ago, folks who were alive, either who were of the so-called silent generation or of the very older so-called baby boomer generation, would often say, if Vietnam hadn't happened, the Great Society would have worked, it would have been tremendous. I've known myself people alive from that time period, or activists or professors who've told me that and said, if it had just been fully funded and Vietnam hadn't happened, everything would have been great. I'm skeptical of that, but I'm wondering how you particularly answer that question.
Well, I would refer to you the chart on page 440, or so that is that, or maybe 439. That's the answer. What people began to realize, that Vietnam is the great sort of excuse story, and Vietnam did help to bring about some of the more expansive bits of legislation. You could say the Great Society would.
Are you talking about the butter price here, the Dunn's chart?
Yeah, and
page 435.
435. But what I'm saying is maybe the Great Society would have been just the good society without Vietnam, because you have to have something really good at home. That's the opposite to what people are arguing with you. And second, even in the 60s, by the late 60s, people saw that the butter at home, the domestic programs, were going to cost more than the guns. That line was crossed. Right. I believe it's in early 70s, 71. And even today, we have this fallacy that defense costs so much. When you look at the whole budget, which includes mandatory spending, defense does not cost so much. It costs a relatively small share of our economy compared to history, period of the Korean War. So this argument isn't reality. And the reason, for example, that we had the fiscal crisis of 1971 and the stagflation and high interest rates of the 70s is not mostly Vietnam. It's the Great Society. And that's very interesting. You know, that's very, foreigners looked at the U.S. and said, it's going kind of social democratic. That's like us, which means its growth advantage may be eroded. Its growth advantage, the U.S. had a growth advantage. It was a freer market than Europe. That growth advantage, that gap between Scandinavia and Michigan is narrowing in terms of social costs, and therefore, the U.S. might not be so strong. So there are plenty of pieces of data that refute your argument, your friend's argument.
Yep.
Yes, Ms. Shlaes. Isn't that the case? The reason the utopianism of the Great Society was almost unchallenged was because there was a lack of faith in civil society, and especially even in the Republican Party after Dwight Eisenhower took the party over and Robert Taft died of cancer in 1953, and in academia too. I mean, there were just a few marginal people. In 1953, Robert Nisbet and Russell Kirk each published classics, The Quest for Community and The Conservative Tradition, but they were considered wackos and outside the society. The Austrian economists too, but and the voter registration was 2.5 Democratic to Republicans. Isn't this the reason why Johnson was a master of the legislative process, that the chance to commit the Great Society even occurred?
That's a very important question. I used to have a debate with Jonathan Alter of Newsweek, and he would say, before the New Deal, Amity, there was nothing. And before the New Deal, there was something. It was just local. It was the Italian-American Burial Society, or it was the county of XYZ, and its little hospital, led by, there was a, David Beto has a beautiful book about Tocquevillian America, which I always give to kids, and all the little weird institutions. Mooseheart, the orphanage, very, right? Yeah, still there. So, yeah, there was a contempt for Tocqueville America. It seemed quaint and old, and it was a terrible contempt because Tocqueville still makes America, the little town. I have a chapter on the fragility of the municipality, where Tocqueville writes about the fragility of the municipality. It's like a consumptive patient. It could die any time, that municipality, because the big state, by which Tocqueville probably meant the county or the state, that is the state of Illinois, Springfield, Albany, might step on it or pull the cord. So when you want to think about Tocqueville's America in this period, I have a long description of the housing program at Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis and what they did to the Tocqueville of downtown St. Louis, which is a very proud town. Maybe some of you are from there, with a very local, strong, let's support each other tradition, just wrecked by urban renewal and bulldozers. And I will just say one last thing. For the middle class, we had something of Tocqueville in our housing funding, because we said, we'll give middle class people subsidized mortgages so they can settle in little communities, the new suburbs, right? And then they can have a cul-de-sac and a car, and their children can play there. And that they'll build a new community, and we'll fund that. The federal government, that's also Levittown. That's for middle class people. For poor people, they can have Karl Marx. And we'll build big, tall, really ugly buildings in the international style, which we kind of admire, but tends to make people feel sad and lonely. And we'll send them up in elevators, and in the halls they'll be beat up by wayward children, and there'll be no commerce at all around them. And certainly, then let's bulldoze the churches around the edge, because we're bulldozing the whole community. So most of the churches go to, and all the other Tocqueville institutions that happen to have been there around where the new tall buildings go. And at the end of the book, I describe how, after all the successive waves of progressivism and non-Tocquevillism at St. Louis Pruitt-Igoe, they had to, as in Chicago, blow it up.
But wasn't one of the, to go back on an earlier point you made, there's a certain, politics is never about one or the other in those absolute ways. It's very rarely that kind of question, right? One of the things the Great Society took advantage of was a natural American desire to try to solve some of these problems, poverty, to allow for growth and expansion and a national economy, right? So they drove right through that because there was as the nation grew and the economy grew and it became larger, there was a need to solve some of these problems. They just thought they could perfect it by using Washington programs to do so.
When I was writing so we want a great society. We're ambitious. It's 1960. We're teenagers and we don't remember World War II, right? The boomers were like the woke students now who say, hey, boomer, right? The boomers were the generational divide, the rebellion. And they said, we want to do something great. The only question is, by what means? Through the public sector or the private sector? Well, we opted for the public sector. And what is the private sector? It's the milk cow that funds it. And you know what? If you leave the private sector alone enough, it usually can fund a lot of whatever you want to do with your great society vision. So in the book, when I was writing it, I decided to tell the story of 3 companies, General Electric, Toyota, which intervened suddenly in Detroit, and the company that became Intel. And these companies did social things. Number one, they created jobs. Number two, Fairchild, which is the predecessor to Intel, for example, had a factory on a Native American reservation and became the greatest private sector employer of Native Americans, because this particular Native American group worked with their hands, did a lot of handiwork, like weaving, basically, or what we would call needlepoint. And making chips involves the same skills plus a magnifying glass, right? So the private sector can do more than we think to solve social problems, and that was it. But we opted for the public sector.
Of course, one of the greatest spokesmen for GE was.
Well, I tell the story in the beginning. They had an actor who worked for GE who was kind of old and not even that good, a little bit corny, and he was hired to propagandize for the free market. And that was Reagan. So Reagan, there he was a middle-aged man now, and he gave not just 50 or 100, but maybe 1,000 speeches about markets to the rubber chicken circuit of the 100 plants of General Electric, because General Electric was concerned that its workers didn't understand that capitalism was fragile. And it all was for naught, I mean, in chapter 1, because GE suffered a terrible embarrassment. Its employees fixed prices in deals with Westinghouse. It was described as like a sports scandal for America because people respected GE as they respect baseball. And it went down in the world, and they fired the actor, and they fired his boss, Lem Boulware, and they got rid of all the little propaganda mill programs, and they thought, what a waste, we screwed up. But Reagan remembered and eventually became a convert to these ideas. He came to believe in markets, by background a New Dealer. So that story is told.
So since you brought that up, Reagan in his 1982 diary famously writes, "The press is dying to paint me as trying to undo the New Deal. I remind them I voted for FDR 4 times. I'm trying to undo the Great Society. It was LBJ's war on poverty that led to our present mess."
Very interesting. I don't have that in the book, I don't think. Is that, yeah. It's the next book. So I mean, history is history.
He saw the Great Society as the enemy to be defeated.
Absolutely. History is history, but it's also characters. They don't have to be presidents. They can be just the next line. So there was a book called Best and the Brightest about the foolish errors of arrogant men in the Vietnam War, planning the Vietnam War, and the execution, the negotiation, the prosecution. There's a domestic Best and the Brightest. That is a bunch of guys who were so smart they thought they could do this, not just Sarge Shriver, but also Walter Reuther. And where is Reagan? He's like the mayors, because he became governor of California, and he had lots of things to do, and the federal government kept getting in the way. And there's a hilarious scene where the governors had a kind of way of vetoing a federal project, a poverty project, but it wasn't a really good veto. They could be overruled, basically. So he was going to overrule something the Nixon administration was doing, which was funding public interest lawyers. And the Nixon didn't want that, because Nixon knew in his heart that Reagan was just as popular as he was, Nixon, right? This is a very awkward moment, and you have the lawyers for Nixon, the president, and the lawyers for Reagan, one of them was Ed Meese, in a room, and the scary administration, led by Frank Carlucci, said, there's an kind of very condescendingly to the Reagan crowd, using a film metaphor, because Reagan would understand that, right? There's a movie where you blow this all up and we blow you up, and forgive me, I don't have the text here, but something like that. And there's a B movie where we make a compromise and neither of us loses face on this lawyers funded by Washington thing, and maybe we'll help you with your welfare cutbacks, which is your big pride, Governor Reagan. And Meese goes into another room and presumably phones Reagan and comes back and says, "We take the B movie." And then Reagan, I think he sent Carlucci a bottle of an alcoholic substance. I believe it might have been scotch. So that was Reagan, the governor. He decided this had all worked out. It wasn't just scorch and burn, right?
Right, yeah.
But the welfare program became a model for welfare reform later, Reagan's own, and then also Clinton's, right?
Yeah. Good. Scott, if I were here, I would, yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, Ms. Shlaes, thank you for coming. Christopher Harris with Unhyphenated America, and I just have a quick question. My family's originally from Detroit, and Walter Williams has talked about how the effect of the Great Society on the black family in particular. And you talk about how the poverty was decreasing had decreased dramatically prior to that. And I've talked to many of my family members, and they say, look, everybody that they grew up with, my father's 69 years old, and basically everybody they grew up with had a mother and a father in a home. I mean, there was a handful of people who did not have a mother and a father in a home. And afterwards, like I'm 46, you'll see that a large percentage of people in my generation did not grow up with a mother and father in a home. Why do you think that the New Deal didn't have such a destructive effect on the black family or families in general such as the Great Society has had on families in general?
It's a great question.
Thank you. Great question. Actually, the family separation issue, the most proximate thing to which you refer is to get welfare money, you had to be a single parent. And the welfare money, and then on top of that, to get subsidized housing. So some of that was pre-Great Society. It was state welfare law, for example, which said we won't support men who earn, but we'll support families with dependent children and no worker, mom. So it was a perverse outcome from a well-meaning plan. And in my description of Pruitt-Igoe, this housing project, which was rather like the housing projects in Detroit, the dads had to hide in the closet when the social worker came because they would lose not only the money, but also the family would the apartment if the dad were discovered. And where is the dad supposed to go? Far away and get a job? That was a huge factor which the Great Society, through the format of its funding, perpetuated and strengthened. And it wasn't just black families, it was white families as well. I would add another factor, though. I really don't like urban renewal. That was I'm paraphrasing, but it says urban renewal is minority removal. And when the riots happened in Detroit, it was said it was the people who had been bulldozed out of old neighborhoods, which were not only poor, not only occasionally slums, but also lively and much loved, bulldozed out of their homes to be put in sterile vertical projects. And they were angry and sad. They were displaced and displaced. They were displaced by slavery, then they were displaced when they moved north, and then they were displaced again from that place where they originally lived when they moved to Detroit. That's a lot of displacement for a family. So I try to describe that in the book, and I very much appreciate your raising that issue. Right?
So another character in your book is Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who, of course, wrote a report on the black family and then was later vilified. Tell us about him.
But the first person in my lifetime I know about who was ever canceled, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, because he wrote a book trying to describe trouble in a single-parent family, particularly maybe when the father who departed or is infrequently present is alcoholic. And by the way, that's Daniel Patrick Moynihan's life. He just happens to be white. So his father was not there, and there were other fathers occasionally, and this was problematic for the Moynihans. So he tried to describe that question, which you just put your finger on, and pretty soon it became to seem condescending for a white person to describe something that is supposed to be uniquely black, which it isn't, and he was shut out by the Democrats. And so I spend a lot of time on Moynihan and his humiliation and loneliness, because he was actually a very insightful guy who had a lot to contribute to government. And his revenge was to come back working for Richard Nixon and offer a program that sounds very familiar today, which is guaranteed income for whites and blacks below a certain income level. But the canceling of Moynihan by the world and Cambridge, Massachusetts, is a bitter and fiery thing to behold.
There's someone over here. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for your talk tonight. One question, so at the very beginning you talked about how the early progressives were very much more focused on the states. It's very much more of a smaller level than federal. And it sounds to me like later on, it's really with the Great Society that you see the progressive thought take root in kind of that federal portion. Woodrow Wilson talks very much in his writings about the idea of a hive mind. He talks about how there's this kind of this general aggregate where everything centralizes in Washington. And to provide kind of an analogy, a lot of people provide how Lincoln almost acts as a fulfillment for the American founding. So in a similar way, could you say that if you want to think of the progressive thought with Wilson as a refounding or a revolution, could you say almost that fulfillment comes about in the Great Society?
Yes. Another question.
Would you care to elaborate?
Remember, did you ever read God and Man at Yale by William F. Buckley? I never read it because I wasn't interested particularly in the God part. But what it's really, the meat of it was they changed the way they teach economics in college. Gee whiz. We used to teach about individuals and, I don't know, the invisible hand and so on. And now all of a sudden it's all about planning. So that commenced this big sea change at universities right after World War II, which meant 15 years worth of undergraduates had been schooled in this planning way of thinking. So now the grown-ups didn't know much about free markets or care about them. They knew about planning. And so those people were ready to take over around 1960. They had become the grown-ups and the leaders.
And that planning grows out of the philosophical roots of the early progressives who thought that progressive experts could solve all problems.
Right. And also there's like a cumulative effect. Planning upon planning yields perversity. Oh, we had that reform last year. Oh, this is the 17th definition of child we've had in the tax code, and each one contradicts the other, and 5 are still part of the law.
It also goes back to the fellow's point here, which is they always, it didn't work because there was some factor that was not right. We'll try it again.
We'll try it, right. This is like a book about it with a bunch of progressive waves within it, and they get bigger and bigger, and the magnitudes of dollars get bigger. Because at the very beginning, Michael Harrington hears from Sergeant Shriver they're going to get $1 billion for welfare. And Michael Harrington says, that's just nickel and dimed. We need more than $1 billion. And Sergeant Shriver says, I don't know about you, young man, but I never had $1 billion to spend before. I think it feels pretty big. But of course, the numbers did go Harrington-wise into the add a few zeros.
So that conversation, just not to be a spoiler, but it's the very beginning of the book, and she doesn't identify who the two people are until you get several pages into the conversation, and it sounds eerily like a conversation you might hear today in the halls of Congress. About very large programs, very large idealistic ideas about what government ought to be doing. Why did we learn any of these lessons? Why are we doing this again?
Well, the motto of the book, which I will say I have heard Coco Chanel say, but also other important people, what is nothing is new, it is just forgotten. Nothing is new, it is just forgotten. The grammar's a little awkward, but I still like it. Nothing is new, but it is just forgotten. We forgot the 70s, which were the consequence.
Well, they were a forgettable decade.
They were definitely forgettable. So what is this? I try to explain the 70s to myself and other people. The 70s was a period when we thought our houses would be smaller than our parents', and they technically were at certain points, and we had 2 fewer bedrooms than we actually needed because the interest rate was 18%. That it was a period where we didn't think we would ever have enough energy to heat our homes. And I don't even want to write the 70s because it's a little dark. I have to figure out a happy 70s. But you think of those of you who remember the ratcheting down of expectation, the emphasis on scarcity is reminiscent of the current environmental movement. I mean there was a philosopher named Paul Ehrlich who actually believed there should be a very heavy tax on diapers so that people would have fewer babies, and also we should change the tax code, no child credit, none of that, and to discourage reproduction because we wouldn't be able to feed ourselves, and more importantly, we were the world's model. And how about introducing the vasectomy, and how about giving a lot of incentives for that procedure? And I find it very creepy looking back, particularly their hubris. And of course, other countries took what we recommended via our World Bank and Mr. McNamara and did awful things with their populations. You're thinking of India and the sterilizations that were virtually forced upon people there as part of our progressive ideal of population reduction.
Let's get a couple more questions. Fellow back there, and then there's one up here too.
Thank you. So my question is, it seems that with the Great Society, there is a certain appeal to nobility. There's a higher aim towards it, the eradication of poverty. So that's a very idealistic sentiment, but also a noble one. Is there a way of introducing a nobility into free market economics that simply isn't rooted in self-interest to provide a sort of greater appeal that would move folks in my generation, I'm a little younger than some of the people here, and allow them to move forward in a productive way?
I think one thing you're talking about is the transactional nature of Silicon Valley. I'll never know the counterparty in this deal. I'm selling him XYZ, and I don't care about him. But that's not most of commerce. Most of free market is everyone you meet, you will meet again. Every person you ever meet in your life will remember the encounter with you and how you handled the transaction. And were you kind? And did you under-deliver or over-deliver? That's what one always tells students. You think you'll never see someone again. You will always see everyone again, and everyone will always remember what your tie, what color it was, or your scarf, and were you polite or did you talk to someone else and did you cheat him? So there is a natural morality to commerce, because when you sell something to someone, they remember that if you cheated them. Most of us avoid bad airports because bad airports lie to us. They advertise a close gate, and then we find we have to walk 2 miles to the gate. They say we have a boarding pass, and then we're unseated, right? So we know when we can to avoid bad airports, which are say low trust places, and we look for high trust places where the airport is even nicer than we thought, and maybe it has free coffee. I think they have that in Toronto. So I like that, and that's not socialism. That's good commerce, right? So I think we have to think about the kindness and the morality in commerce, and expose it. Let's think of it this way: eBay. When we were young, people my age again, we wouldn't have believed that eBay could work. Because you send your money off to someone in another state who nobody you know knows, and he or she sends you back more or less the thing you ordered, right? More or less. And sometimes it's a part which you haven't inspected yourself, like a car part. Oh my gosh, and it might be flawed in some way where that other person could say he technically sent you a good thing, but the thing is useless to you. And we might send $185 for a car part if we're building a car. And yet, most of the time, eBay works. Most of the time, most of us are satisfied with eBay and say, well, that is an incredibly wonderful economy where the people don't cheat each other. There's a kind of broker ref, that would be the eBay company. And most of the time, and the same is for Airbnb, most of the time, you don't get murdered. Most of the time, even on Craigslist, you don't get, now most of the time on Craigslist, you don't get cheated. The stories that you hear in Uber, they're the exception. So there's a lot of evidence of a great commercial economy involving a lot of kindness and respect for fellow men and a lot of utils, to put it in, a lot of benefit to people that is underappreciated.
I was thinking of Reagan's great retort was the creative society.
Right. When Reagan is a very sad character in this book. He loses his job at GE and he can't get any good roles, but he does give a good speech for Barry Goldwater. Yeah. And then he decides he might run for governor of California, and he says, what am I going to call it? And he actually goes to a minister, and they come up with or the minister already has and offers creative society, which is what the companies are. Do you think the Intel people, when they started and were at Fairchild, did they think they could ever invent something that would be so useful? No. They also believed that everything you ever did in their area was in service of government. They were stuck in the military industrial. What do you build computer parts, electronics for? The government. Only the government can have a big computer, right?
No one else would use these.
Nobody else would use it. And what they realized, and I follow them, and you can see it dawning on them, and it is like the sun coming into their life, is somebody might buy what I'm making who's not a government. And somebody might buy enough of it that I would have money for research to invent something that wouldn't be for government. That's the story of Bob Noyce and Gordon Moore. They have a few epiphanies. One is Moore's Law, which is you can make smaller chips pretty soon. And there's a kind of geometric acceleration there. But the other is, wow, big companies that make technical things in STEM actually serve regular people. And there's a tremendous relief at that discovery. And Reagan doesn't really get it. He only sort of gets it. But he has an intuitive appreciation for the entrepreneurial, because to be an actor, you have to be entrepreneurial. You have a lot of humiliation,
right?
A lot of highs, a lot of
failure.
A lot of failure. So,
yes, sir.
To what extent do you credit? Sorry, right. No,
oh, wait.
Right here. Hi, sorry. To what extent do you credit? Because going on parallel to the start of the Great Society is the civil rights movement. To what extent do you credit the fact that the civil rights movement then now would largely be seen as a positive use of federal power over localities in order to achieve a common good of expanding civil rights throughout the nation as a convincing mechanism for people who might otherwise have been cautious as a society of what the federal government can do and might have had a greater trust in their localities? The civil rights movement seems to have, to me, reversed the presumption that the localities were in fact trustworthy.
Right, because only 8% of people, black, are registered to vote in Mississippi, a tragedy at the beginning of this, wrong, needs fixed, right? Therefore, we must bus every kid in every city across the northern part of America, is what you're describing. Because the federal government intervened, and some of us feel rightly, with the Civil Rights Act and then the Voting Rights Act, which was subsequent, we gave it license to intervene everywhere and write policy for all towns. Yeah, of course I credit it. It's a hard call because something had to happen in the South if only 8% of a certain group are registered to vote. I don't know how to fix that. In the book, what I say is the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Law, I don't think were negative. They were positive. But when we began to move, as Johnson did with his 1965 speech at Howard University, where he basically signed up for affirmative action and something beyond equality of opportunity, moving to equality of result, that was an overstep because you always disappoint people when you promise equality of result.
So, Amity, this is a wonderful book. I'm thoroughly enjoying it. The people, the stories. I want to give you the last point to you. What would you like to add or suggest that we've not talked about?
I think the thing that surprised me most in writing this book was the importance of labor unions. Labor unions are hard to understand. They have their own language. They have their own court, the NLRB. Most of the time, most people don't understand what's going on. But what happened basically in the 60s was the labor unions were the core of the Democratic Party, much more so than today, as many of you know, because of the way our laws have changed and some restraint and because of the weakness of our labor unions. And they decided what happened. Example, there was a big student movement that started at Port Huron, Michigan. The Port Huron statement is legendary. And what I didn't know till I researched this book was that Port Huron meeting of Tom Hayden, who became a legendary SDS person, and Michael Harrington and a few others, was essentially made possible by the AFL-CIO and the UAW. Not only that, but Hayden was later paid by the UAW to do the little mischief he did in Newark, New Jersey. And what is tragic and a good story is Walter Reuther, the head of the United Auto Workers, I regard as a kind of flawed hero. Walter Reuther just thought, well, let's have a youth wing. What's wrong with funding youth? A lot of them are going to go to college. Well, that's more members for my union. Maybe I could have 2 million members instead of 1 million in the United Auto Workers and squeeze out those Teamsters. So I'm going to put them on a long leash. Those students, well, they're wild. Well, I was wild. I went to Russia. You know, they're wild, and I'll look the other way and hope that if I fund them and love them and be like their dad, then later they'll come and be loyal to me. And instead, what those students did, the Students for a Democratic Society, was wild. They did ruin the Chicago Convention, was hand the election of 1968 to Walter Reuther's opponent. Oh, so bitter. Imagine the Passover scenes. Imagine the family dinners. Reuther just couldn't believe that the youth would turn against him, he who did so much for them and his union. And what's very sad about Reuther was he actually died, not of disappointment, but in one of those rickety, wrong early Learjets. He was in a terrible plane crash going to a kind of utopian place in Black Lake, Michigan, that he had built a retreat for union workers. But it is symbolic because his dream of a social democratic America also died at that point. So that I didn't know. And if you come from the Midwest and are of a certain age, you heard Walter Reuther's name every night of your childhood, along with the Vietnam War count, right? The casualties were, and Walter Reuther said, because the unions were so important. So I will say, I learned a lot about them. They're not that complicated. They were wrong. They're an example of lovable people trying to help other people and doing something that does not have a positive result.
Okay, Amity, it's been great having you here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I have so much enjoyed your work on your book on Coolidge, and your work on Coolidge is wonderful. But these two books, The Forgotten Man and the New Deal, if you've not read that, I really recommend that. And then now this new history of the Great Society will be the contrarian, but very important books on liberalism in the 20th century. So Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us.